The diner was alive with the comforting hum of daily life. Plates clattered against tables as waitresses moved swiftly, balancing trays laden with steaming pancakes, crisp bacon, and eggs sunny side up. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the aroma of buttery toast, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere that wrapped around every patron like an old friend. Conversations filled the air, soft murmurs between couples, cheerful greetings from the staff, and the occasional burst of laughter from a group of friends enjoying a leisurely breakfast. In the corner booth, slightly hidden behind a tall, polished divider, sat Cassie Dawson. Her head was bent low, the dim overhead light casting a soft glow on her short brown hair. Her faded hoodie, a deep maroon with a small logo of her college barely visible, looked well worn but comfortable. A large backpack, stuffed to the brim, rested on the seat beside her, its straps frayed from years of use. Cassie's face was calm, her lips slightly pursed as her pen danced across the lined pages of her notebook. She was lost in her own world, her focus unwavering despite the lively chatter surrounding her. Cassie was a college freshman, a face among many in the bustling town. To the casual observer, she seemed like any other student, a bit tired, perhaps, from late-night study sessions or early morning classes. Her hands, delicate yet strong, flipped through pages of neatly organized notes. She paused occasionally to sip from the steaming cup of tea placed carefully at the edge of her table, her movements precise, almost deliberate. But what no one in that diner could see, what none of them could have guessed, was that Cassie Dawson was far from ordinary. The sound came suddenly, breaking through the rhythm of the diner like a sharp crack of thunder. The rumble of engines grew louder, a low, growling noise that made the windows tremble slightly. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward the source. The roar of motorcycles filled the air, and moments later, the glass door of the diner swung open with a force that rattled the bell above it. They entered like a storm, a group of men clad in black leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias. Their boots clomped heavily against the tiled floor, and their presence seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, strode in first. His name, as the town's regulars knew, was Rick, a name often spoken in hushed tones, accompanied by a shake of the head or a muttered warning. Rick's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every face before landing on Cassie. His smirk stretched across his face, a look that spelled trouble. The rest of the bikers followed his lead, spreading out and claiming seats with an air of entitlement. "Hey, study girl," Rick's voice cut through the muted murmur that had settled over the diner. His tone was mocking, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet you can't even lift that backpack, let alone hold a real conversation." Laughter erupted from his group, a raucous sound that made some of the patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. The waitress behind the counter froze mid-pour, her eyes darting toward Cassie as though unsure of what might happen next. Cassie didn't look up. Her pen continued to glide across the page, her posture unchanged. It was as if she hadn't heard him, though the faint tightening of her jaw suggested otherwise. Rick wasn't about to let the lack of response slide. He took a step closer, towering over her booth. "What's the matter? Too busy scribbling your little notes to talk to a real man?" His friends chuckled, egging him on. Still, Cassie remained silent. Her fingers gripped her pen just a fraction tighter, but her eyes never left her notebook. "She's scared," one of the bikers chimed in from the counter, his voice dripping with mockery. "Can't blame her. Rick's got that effect on people." More laughter followed, the kind that bounced off the walls and seemed to fill every corner of the room. Cassie's stillness amidst the chaos only seemed to provoke them further. Rick leaned in closer, resting a hand on the edge of her table. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't ignore me. That's not very polite, is it?" His grin widened, exposing a row of teeth that seemed as sharp as his tone. The diner's patrons watched with bated breath. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if they should intervene, while others stared down at their plates, pretending not to notice. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Cassie slowly placed her pen down, the sound of it hitting the paper almost inaudible amidst the noise. She took a sip of her tea, her movements measured, unhurried. Finally, she raised her eyes to meet Rick's. Her gaze was calm, steady, a direct contrast to the chaotic energy radiating from the group. "I'm just trying to study," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Please leave me alone." Rick straightened, feigning offense. "Well, isn't she polite?" he drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "All right, study girl, you win. I'll leave you to your little books." He turned to walk away, but then, almost as an afterthought, he paused. Turning back, he leaned down once more, his face mere inches from hers. "But just so you know," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "you're lucky I'm feeling generous today." The group erupted into laughter again as Rick rejoined his friends, their voices filling the diner with exaggerated stories and crude jokes. Cassie exhaled quietly, picking up her pen and resuming her notes as if nothing had happened. Her expression remained neutral, but behind those eyes was a depth that no one in that diner could have fathomed. Because what no one there knew was that Cassie Dawson wasn't your average college student. Far from it. Rick's laughter boomed as he turned back to his crew, his boots echoing heavily against the diner's tiled floor. The other bikers jeered along with him, their voices a mix of mockery and smug confidence. The waitress at the counter shot a nervous glance toward Cassie, but the young woman didn't look up. Her pen continued moving steadily across the page, her focus unbroken despite the noise. "Man, she's got nerves of steel, huh?" one of the bikers remarked sarcastically, elbowing the man next to him. "Didn't even flinch." Rick waved him off with a scoff. "She's just scared stiff, is all. Too quiet, like a mouse trapped in a corner." His tone was loud, deliberately meant to be heard by Cassie. "They always break, though. Just takes the right amount of pressure." Cassie heard every word. Her hand slowed for a brief moment, but she didn't stop writing. The lines of her notes grew more deliberate, her focus sharpening like a blade. The diner, once alive with friendly chatter, had shifted into an uneasy quiet. Conversations were now hushed, fragmented as patrons whispered about the scene unfolding before them. A man in the booth next to Cassie leaned toward his wife, his voice barely audible. "Should we do something?" he asked, his concern evident. His wife shook her head quickly, her eyes darting toward the bikers. "No way. You know who they are. It's not worth the trouble." It was a sentiment shared by most in the diner. Rick and his gang weren't new to the area. They'd rolled through town many times before, each visit leaving behind stories of intimidation and chaos. No one wanted to be the one to stand up to them. But Cassie didn't seem fazed. She finished the page she was working on, carefully turned it over, and started on the next. Her movements were methodical, almost too calm for someone who'd just been singled out in such a public way. Rick, however, wasn't done. He leaned against the counter, drumming his fingers loudly on the surface as he watched her with narrowed eyes. The playful smirk on his face had shifted into something more calculating. "What's she writing, anyway?" he said, his voice carrying across the room. "A love letter? A grocery list? Maybe it's a little diary entry about the big, scary bikers in the diner." The others chuckled at his words, their laughter grating against the already tense atmosphere. Rick turned to the waitress, who was pretending to busy herself with wiping down the counter. "Hey, darlin'," he called out, snapping his fingers to get her attention. "Why don't you bring study girl another drink? Tea's not going to help her grow a backbone." The waitress hesitated, her rag frozen mid-wipe. Her cheeks flushed as she glanced at Cassie, who shook her head ever so slightly. "I'm fine, thank you," Cassie said, her voice calm and polite. She didn't look up from her notebook. Rick pushed away from the counter and approached her booth again. This time, the air seemed to thicken with tension. He placed both hands on the edge of her table, leaning forward until his shadow fell over her notes. "Kman, sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping into a low, mocking tone. "We're just trying to have a little fun. Why don't you join the party? Or are you too good for us?" Cassie finally stopped writing. She set her pen down neatly beside her notebook and folded her hands in her lap. When she looked up, her eyes met Rick's directly. "I've asked you nicely," she said, her tone steady and even. "Please leave me alone." Her words were simple, but there was something in her gaze that gave Rick pause. It wasn't fear, as he'd expected. It wasn't anger, either. It was something far quieter, but infinitely more unsettling, a kind of unshakable confidence that he didn't quite know how to place. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what Rick would do. For a moment, it seemed like he might back off. He straightened, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully as he studied her. Then he laughed. It was a loud, grating sound that filled the diner, breaking the spell of silence. All right," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to scare you, study girl. We'll leave you to your homework." He turned back to his crew, shaking his head as though to dismiss her entirely. The other bikers laughed along with him, but their amusement felt forced, like they weren't quite sure what to make of the interaction. Cassie exhaled quietly and picked up her pen again. She didn't glance at the people around her, didn't acknowledge the whispers that had started up once more. She simply returned to her notes, her face as calm as ever. But the tension in the room didn't dissipate. The bikers' voices grew louder as they exchanged stories and jokes, their laughter grating against the nerves of everyone else in the diner. The waitress moved carefully around them, her shoulders tense as she refilled their coffee cups without making eye contact. In her booth, Cassie kept writing. To the casual observer, she seemed utterly unbothered, her focus unwavering. But if anyone had looked closer, they might have noticed the slight tightening of her grip on the pen, the faint crease between her brows. Because what no one in that diner knew, what no one could have guessed, was that Cassie Dawson wasn't your average college freshman. And while she had no interest in confrontation, she wasn't the type to back down, either. She wasn't just a student, poring over notes and preparing for finals. She was something else entirely. And if Rick pushed her any further, he'd find out exactly what that meant. The tension was as sharp as the smell of burnt toast lingering in the air. Rick's gang had claimed their territory with the force of a thunderstorm. Chairs scraped noisily against the tiles as they pushed tables together, making their presence impossible to ignore. Their laughter was loud, grating, and deliberate, a warning to anyone thinking of standing in their way. They barked orders at the waitress, who nodded quickly and scurried to the kitchen. The regular patrons kept their eyes down, their conversations now reduced to whispers. A young couple in the corner exchanged uneasy glances, the man adjusting his chair to shield his partner from view. In her booth, Cassie's pen hovered over the page. She'd heard them, of course, how could she not? But she kept her eyes trained on her notes, determined to stay invisible. That hope was dashed when Rick sauntered over. He leaned against the edge of her booth, his leather jacket creaking as he folded his arms. His grin was wide, the kind of grin that had cowed dozens before her. "You too good to say hi, sweetheart," he sneered, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the diner. His crew chuckled behind him, their amusement echoing off the walls. Cassie looked up slowly, her eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, no flinch or hesitation, just a calm, steady focus that didn't waver even under his scrutiny. "I'm just trying to study," she said simply, her voice steady but quiet. "Please leave me alone." Rick's grin widened, his teeth flashing as he leaned in closer. "Studying's for weaklings. How about you take a break and show us if you can handle a real conversation?" Behind him, his crew laughed again, their voices a chorus of mockery. One of them clapped his hands, adding, "Yeah, show us what you've got, study girl." The diner was silent apart from them. The waitress, carrying a tray of drinks, froze mid-step. Her eyes darted nervously between Rick and Cassie, as though waiting for someone to intervene. Cassie, however, didn't blink. Her expression didn't change, her hands still resting on the table. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," she said, her tone as neutral as ever. Rick raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being brushed off. His grin faltered for the briefest of moments before returning, sharper and meaner. "Oh, we've got plenty to talk about," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Like how you think you're too good to say hello when someone's being friendly. That's not very nice, is it?" The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Cassie tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, just an unsettling calm that seemed out of place in the face of Rick's aggression. "I didn't mean to be rude," she said evenly. "But I really need to focus. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me." Rick straightened, his grin fading entirely now. The room felt even smaller, the walls closing in as his friends fell silent. All eyes were on Cassie and Rick, the tension so heavy it seemed to press against everyone's chest. "You've got some nerve," Rick said, his voice quieter but far more dangerous. "Most people know when to keep their mouths shut." Cassie didn't respond immediately. She reached for her cup of tea, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. Her calmness wasn't forced, it was deliberate, practiced. "I know when to speak," she said finally, her voice steady. "And I also know when someone's just trying to make trouble." A low whistle came from one of Rick's crew, followed by scattered chuckles. "Looks like she's got a little bite," one of them said, grinning. Rick's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked as unassuming as Cassie. His pride demanded a response, something to reassert his dominance. "Trouble," he repeated, his tone mocking. "Sweetheart, you don't even know what trouble looks like." Cassie set her pen down and folded her hands neatly on the table. Her eyes didn't leave his for a second. "Then it's a good thing I'm not interested in finding out," she said. Rick's laugh was harsh, cutting through the diner like the snap of a whip. He gestured toward her notebook, shaking his head. "What are you even studying, huh? How to be boring. Maybe you should put that pen down and live a little." The waitress took a cautious step forward, her tray clinking as the glasses trembled in her hands. Sir," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you should just." Rick turned sharply, his glare freezing her in place. "What?" he snapped. The waitress stammered, her face flushing. I just mean, maybe let her be. She's not bothering anyone." Rick's grin returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, she's not bothering anyone? She's bothering me." He jabbed a thumb toward his chest, his voice rising again. "And I don't like being ignored." Cassie's voice cut through the growing noise, calm and clear. "She's just trying to do her job," she said. "You don't need to take it out on her." Rick turned back to her, his grin replaced by a scowl. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he stepped back, laughing humorlessly as he shook his head. "You've got a smart mouth, you know that," he said, pointing at her. "But I'll tell you what, you keep hiding behind your books, and one day, you're gonna find out that smarts don't mean a damn thing in the real world." He walked away, joining his friends at their makeshift table. The tension didn't disappear, it lingered, like the smell of burnt coffee that wouldn't fade no matter how many times the pot was washed. Cassie picked up her pen and resumed her notes as though nothing had happened. But the faint crease in her brow suggested otherwise. The waitress, visibly shaken, brought Rick and his crew their drinks. She glanced at Cassie as she passed, her eyes full of silent gratitude and curiosity. Because while Cassie looked calm on the surface, there was something about her that didn't quite add up. Something in the way she held herself, the way she met Rick's gaze without flinching, made it clear that she wasn't as ordinary as she seemed. And Rick, though he didn't realize it yet, had just made the worst mistake of his day. Rick slumped into his chair at the makeshift table his crew had taken over, but his eyes lingered on Cassie. She hadn't crumbled under his usual intimidation tactics, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people would have stammered apologies, cracked under the pressure, or tried to laugh it off. But not her. She sat there, scribbling in that notebook, as if his words were nothing more than background noise. It wasn't just Cassie's reaction or lack of one that gnawed at him. It was the way she looked at him, with eyes that seemed to see right through him. Like she knew something he didn't. That unnerved him. His buddy, Duke, leaned across the table, grinning. "What's the deal with her, huh? Quiet types like that usually break easy. You losing your touch, Rick?" Rick snorted, masking his irritation. "Nah. She's just putting on a front. I could crack her like an egg if I wanted to." The others laughed, slapping the table and throwing in their own taunts about the study girl. But beneath the noise, Rick's mind churned. He wasn't about to let some bookworm make him look weak, not in front of his crew. Meanwhile, Cassie turned another page in her notebook, her pen moving steadily across the paper. To anyone watching, she seemed completely engrossed in her work. But in reality, her senses were on high alert. She could feel Rick's gaze burning into her, hear the sneering comments his crew made at her expense. And yet, she remained calm. Her training had taught her that calm was a weapon, one that most people didn't expect. When others were ruled by adrenaline and emotion, staying calm could be the difference between control and chaos. The waitress approached her table cautiously, a cup of fresh tea in her hand. "Here," she whispered, setting it down with a trembling smile. "On the house." Cassie looked up and gave her a small nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. The waitress lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but a sharp whistle from Rick's table made her jump. "Hey!" Rick called out, waving an empty coffee mug in the air. "We're dying of thirst over here." The waitress scurried away, her face flushed. Rick's crew erupted in laughter again, their voices filling the diner. A man sitting at the counter muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "They think they own the place." "Just let them be," his friend replied quietly. "You don't want to get mixed up with guys like that." But not everyone in the diner was content to stay silent. Near the door, an older man in a flannel shirt stood up, his jaw tight with disapproval. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent decades working with his hands. "Hey, leave her alone," he said, his voice firm but calm. The diner fell silent. Rick slowly turned in his chair, his lips curling into a grin. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, leaning back with exaggerated ease. The man didn't flinch. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies," he replied, crossing his arms over his chest. Rick's grin widened. "Bullies? Nah, you've got it all wrong, old man. We're just having a little fun. Right, boys?" His crew laughed on cue, but the sound was forced, lacking the confidence of before. The man took a step closer. "Doesn't look like she's having fun to me." Cassie glanced up from her notebook, her eyes flicking between the two men. She appreciated the gesture, but she didn't need or want a protector. This was her fight, if it came to that. Rick pushed back his chair and stood up, towering over the older man. "You've got a lot of nerve, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. And you've got a lot of nerve, picking on someone minding their own business," the man shot back, his voice steady. For a moment, it seemed like things might escalate. Rick clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he sized the man up. But then he let out a bark of laughter, stepping back with exaggerated ease. All right, he said, holding up his hands. No need to get worked up, old man. We'll play nice. For now. He turned back to his table, clapping Duke on the shoulder. Come on, let's eat before the food gets cold. The older man watched them for a moment longer before returning to his seat, though his eyes remained sharp and watchful. Cassie exhaled quietly, her focus returning to her notes. But she knew it wasn't over. Rick wasn't the type to let things go, especially when his pride was at stake. And sure enough, Rick's gaze kept drifting back to her as he ate, his expression darkening with every glance. He wasn't done with her. Not by a long shot. Cassie, however, was ready. She didn't look like much to Rick, or to anyone else in the diner for that matter. But appearances could be deceiving. She knew how to handle bullies like him. And if Rick decided to push her any further, he'd find out exactly how wrong he was. The tension in the diner was thick, every eye glued to Cassie as she stood with an eerie calm that seemed out of place against the biker's jeers. Rick leaned back in his chair, smirking, clearly amused. His crew joined in with exaggerated laughs, their bravado filling the room. Look at her, one of them said, slapping the table. She thinks she's in a movie or something. Cassie didn't flinch. Her fingers tightened slightly on the strap of her backpack as she stepped toward the door. But instead of leaving, she stopped just short of the threshold and turned back. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on the waitress, the older man in the flannel, and the couple cowering near the corner. It wasn't fear or hesitation in her expression, it was calculation, as though she was sizing up every variable in the room. You should be careful, she said, her voice steady but quiet. Rick cocked his head, his smirk fading slightly. What was that? I said, Cassie repeated, a touch louder now, you should be careful. You're making a lot of noise, but you don't know who's listening. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over the patrons like a blanket. Rick's brow furrowed, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. You're real funny, study girl, he said after a beat, his voice harder now. But jokes won't get you out of here any faster. Cassie took another step toward him, her movements slow and deliberate. She set her backpack on the floor, the sound of its weight hitting the tiles louder than it should have been. I'm not joking, she said simply. Rick stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His gang shifted behind him, their laughter replaced with a tense silence. What's your deal? He demanded, his voice laced with irritation. You think you're tough or something? Cassie tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving his. No, she replied. But I've dealt with your type before. And it always ends the same way. That struck a nerve. Rick's face darkened, and he took a step closer, his fists clenched. You've got a big mouth for someone who's about to regret it, he growled. The older man in the flannel stood again, his voice firm. That's enough, kid. Let her be. Rick turned sharply, pointing a finger at him. Sit down, old man. This doesn't concern you. The man didn't move, his eyes flicking briefly to Cassie. I don't think you want to do this, he said quietly. Rick sneered, but before he could respond, Cassie spoke again. He's right, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. You don't want to do this. Rick turned back to her, his frustration boiling over. And why's that, huh? He snapped. You think you're gonna scare me with that tough talk? Cassie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and unzipped her backpack, pulling out a neatly folded sweatshirt. She held it up for a moment before draping it over a nearby chair. The motion revealed the plain black t-shirt she wore underneath, simple, unremarkable, except for the small emblem stitched on the sleeve. It took a moment for anyone to notice it, but when they did, the shift in the room was palpable. The emblem was a patch, one that some recognized instantly. It was small but unmistakable, a golden eagle clutching an anchor and globe, the symbol of the United States Marine Corps. The older man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. The waitress gasped softly, her tray trembling in her hands. Even the bikers hesitated, their confidence faltering as they exchanged uncertain glances. Rick, however, scoffed. "So what?" he said, forcing a laugh. "You're some wannabe soldier or something." Cassie's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Not a soldier," she said. "A Marine." Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Rick's grin wavered, but he quickly recovered. "Big deal," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier swagger. "You think that's supposed to impress me?" Cassie shrugged. "I don't care if it impresses you," she replied. "But it should make you think twice." Rick's jaw tightened, his pride warring with his instincts. His crew, meanwhile, seemed less certain. One of them leaned in and muttered something, but Rick shook him off. "Nah," he said loudly, his bravado returning. "I'm not scared of some little Marine. You're just a girl playing tough." Cassie sighed softly, her fingers flexing at her sides. She stepped forward again, closing the distance between them until she was just a few feet away. "Do you know what Marines are trained to do?" she asked, her tone conversational but laced with an undercurrent of steel. Rick opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him the chance. "We're trained to assess threats," she continued, her voice steady. "To neutralize them quickly and efficiently. To make sure no one under our protection gets hurt." Her gaze swept the room, pausing on the other patrons. "And right now," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you're the biggest threat in this room." Rick's face twisted with anger. "You think you can take me on?" he snarled. Cassie's expression didn't change. "I know I can," she said simply. The quiet confidence in her tone was more unsettling than any shout or threat could have been. Rick's crew shifted uncomfortably, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. One of them, the one who had tried to warn Rick, finally spoke up. "Hey, man, maybe we should just let it go," he said, his voice low. "This isn't worth it." Rick glared at him, but the man didn't back down. "She's not bluffing," he added. "Look at her." Rick hesitated, his gaze flicking back to Cassie. For the first time, he seemed to really see her not just as some quiet girl with a backpack, but as something far more dangerous. Cassie didn't move, her posture relaxed but ready. The room held its breath, waiting for Rick's next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rick let out a harsh laugh. "Fine," he said, throwing up his hands. "You win, Marine. We'll back off." But the tension in his voice suggested he wasn't done. "Not really." Cassie didn't respond. She simply picked up her sweatshirt, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and turned toward the door. As she walked out, the older man in the flannel nodded at her, a small but knowing gesture. Cassie returned it with the faintest of smiles before stepping into the crisp evening air. Inside the diner, Rick sat back down, his pride battered but not broken. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. And Cassie, already halfway down the street, knew it. Rick stared at the door long after it had swung shut behind Cassie, the bell above it jingling softly. His fists clenched, his knuckles white against the tabletop. The laughter of his crew had long since died out, replaced by an uneasy silence. "She walked out, man." "Just leave it," Duke muttered, leaning closer to Rick. His voice was low, almost pleading. Rick shot him a sharp glare. "You think I'm gonna let some bookworm with a Marine patch show me up? It's not about showing you up," Duke replied, his tone more cautious now. She's not bluffing, Rick. You saw the way she looked at you. That's not someone you mess with. Rick shoved his chair back abruptly, the screech of the legs against the tile making everyone flinch. She thinks she's better than me, he spat. I'm not letting her walk away like that. The other bikers exchanged wary glances. They weren't used to seeing Rick this rattled, but none of them dared to challenge him outright. Meanwhile, the rest of the diner had settled into a tense quiet. The older man in the flannel returned to his seat, but his sharp eyes remained fixed on Rick's table. The waitress lingered by the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she refilled a coffee pot. Outside, Cassie walked with purpose, her steps steady despite the chaos she had left behind. She could feel the weight of the encounter pressing on her, but she didn't let it show. Years of training had taught her how to carry herself under pressure, how to project calm even when the situation was anything but. She rounded the corner and slipped into a small alleyway, her back against the cool brick wall. From her pocket, she pulled out a phone and quickly dialed a number. "It's me," she said when the line connected. "Something's brewing. Might need backup." The voice on the other end responded with a curt, "Understood. Stay sharp." Cassie hung up and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't want to escalate things, but she wasn't naive. Rick was the kind of man who thrived on dominance, and she had just taken that from him in front of his crew. He wouldn't let it go. Back at the diner, Rick stood abruptly, his chair toppling over behind him. "Let's go," he barked at his crew. "Go where?" Duke asked, though the answer was obvious. Rick shot him a look that brooked no argument. "We're gonna remind her who's in charge." The crew hesitated, their earlier bravado now tempered with unease. But one by one, they rose from the table, following Rick out the door. The bell jingled again, and the waitress let out a shaky breath. The older man in the flannel leaned toward her. "You should call someone," he said quietly. The waitress nodded, fumbling for her phone as she glanced nervously at the door. Outside, Rick scanned the street, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Cassie's retreating figure in the distance. "There," he growled, motioning for his crew to follow. Cassie sensed them before she heard them. The low rumble of their boots on the pavement reached her ears, and she allowed herself a small sigh. She had hoped they'd let it go, but deep down, she had known better. She turned into another alley, this one leading to an open lot at the edge of town. The space was quiet, deserted except for a few scattered trash bins and the faint glow of a distant street lamp. When she reached the center of the lot, she stopped and turned to face them. Rick and his crew emerged from the shadows, their silhouettes menacing against the dim light. Well, Rick drawled, his grin returning as he stepped forward. "Looks like we've got you all to ourselves now." Cassie didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her posture relaxed but ready. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Rick continued, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "But guts won't help you now." He took another step closer, his hands clenched into fists. Cassie tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You've already lost, Rick," she said calmly. Rick barked a laugh. "Lost? Lady, the only thing I've lost is my patience. Now you're gonna learn what happens when you mess with me." Cassie's eyes flicked to the rest of his crew. They stood behind him, their expressions ranging from uncertain to outright nervous. "You don't have to follow him," she said, addressing them directly. "This isn't your fight." Rick whirled on them, his voice sharp. "Don't listen to her. She's just trying to mess with your heads." One of the bikers, a younger man with a hesitant look, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just call it a night," he muttered. Rick rounded on him, grabbing him by the collar. "You want out? Fine. But don't come crawling back when I'm done with her." The younger man wrenched free and stepped back, his hands raised defensively. "I'm out," he said firmly. "This isn't worth it." Rick glared at him, his face a mask of fury. "Coward," he spat. The man didn't respond. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Rick turned back to Cassie, his anger now at a boiling point. "You've got nowhere to run," he snarled. Cassie's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I wasn't planning on running." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Rick lunged forward, his fist swinging toward her. But Cassie was faster. In a blur of motion, she sidestepped his attack and caught his arm, twisting it with practiced precision. Rick let out a startled cry as he was forced to his knees, his face contorted in pain. The remaining bikers froze, their eyes wide as they watched Cassie move with a grace and efficiency that spoke of years of training. Rick struggled, but Cassie held him firmly in place. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice low but firm. "Walk away. All of you." For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the bikers began to back away, their confidence shattered. Rick glared up at her, his pride wounded beyond repair. "You think this is over," he spat. Cassie released him, stepping back as he staggered to his feet. "It is if you're smart," she replied. Rick didn't respond. He stumbled back toward his crew, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. Cassie watched them go, her expression unreadable. When they were finally out of sight, she exhaled quietly and adjusted her backpack. The night was quiet again, but Cassie knew this was only the beginning. The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they took in the sight before them. Cassie's posture was calm but charged with energy, like a coiled spring ready to strike. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the stunned silence. Rick's eyes darted to his crew, searching for backup. "She's bluffing," he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. "No way she's the real deal." Cassie tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Want to find out?" she asked, her tone casual but laced with a challenge. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward hesitantly. "Rick, man, maybe we should." "Shut up." Rick snapped, his face flushing with anger. He turned back to Cassie, his pride outweighing his common sense. "You think you can scare me with some fancy moves," he sneered, though his voice wavered. Cassie didn't respond. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, her movements fluid and deliberate. It wasn't just a stance, it was a statement. She was ready, and they all knew it. The scarred man hesitated, then took another step forward. "Rick, I don't think this is a good idea." Rick spun on him, shoving him backward. "She's nothing. Just some college kid with a big mouth." The tension in the lot was suffocating. Cassie's eyes swept over the group, her expression calm but calculating. She could see the cracks forming, the uncertainty spreading through the gang like wildfire. "I'll make this easy for you," she said, her voice cutting through the charged air. "Walk away. Now." Rick laughed, though it sounded more like a bark. "And let you play the hero? Not a chance." He lunged at her, his movements wild and fueled by desperation. But Cassie was ready. In a blur, she sidestepped him, her hand snapping out to deflect his attack. Her movements were precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. Rick stumbled, his balance thrown off as Cassie twisted his arm and sent him sprawling to the ground. The impact echoed in the stillness, and the other bikers stared, their mouths agape. Cassie didn't give them time to recover. She stepped back, her stance still defensive but commanding. "Who's next?" she asked, her voice even. The scarred man raised his hands, taking a cautious step back. "Not me," he muttered. "I'm out." Another biker followed suit, muttering something about how this wasn't worth it. One by one, they backed away, their confidence shattered. Rick struggled to his feet, his face a mix of rage and humiliation. "Cowards," he spat at his crew. "All of you." Cassie watched him, her gaze unyielding. "This isn't about them," she said. "It's about you. You don't get to bully people just because you're angry at the world." Rick glared at her, his chest heaving. "You think you're better than me?" "No," Cassie replied, her voice steady. "I just know who I am. And that's something you can't take away." For a moment, Rick looked like he might try to lunge at her again. But something in her eyes stopped him. He staggered backward, his shoulders slumping. "Let's go," he muttered to the remaining bikers, his voice low. They didn't argue. The group shuffled away, their swagger replaced by shame and uncertainty. Cassie stood there for a moment, watching them go. When the last of them disappeared into the shadows, she exhaled, her posture relaxing. The sound of slow clapping broke the silence. Cassie turned to see the older man from the diner stepping out of the shadows, a wry smile on his face. "Not bad, kid," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Not bad at all." Cassie raised an eyebrow. "You followed me." "Figured you might need a witness," he replied, shrugging. "Not that you did." Cassie allowed herself a small smile. "Thanks." The man nodded, then gestured to the lot. "You know, you've got a knack for handling trouble. Ever think about using it for more than self-defense?" Cassie's smile faded slightly, her gaze turning thoughtful. "I've done my share," she said softly. "But sometimes, trouble finds you anyway." The man chuckled. "Well, if trouble ever finds you again, let me know. People like you, we need more of that." Cassie nodded, the faintest hint of a smile returning to her lips. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, she turned and walked away, the lot growing quiet once more. But her words lingered, a quiet echo in the night. Sometimes, strength isn't about fighting, it's about standing firm, knowing who you are, and refusing to back down. And in that moment, Cassie knew, she'd won more than just a fight. She'd reclaimed her peace. As Cassie made her way back to the street, the distant rumble of the remaining bikers' motorcycles gradually faded away. The night air felt cool against her skin, but she didn't shiver. Inside, she was warm, satisfied with the quiet victory she'd just earned. The confrontation had been intense, but it hadn't been the first time she'd faced down someone trying to test her strength, her control. She walked a little slower, reflecting on the events of the evening. As much as she hated confrontation, sometimes it was necessary. Rick had learned that the hard way. By the time she reached the main street, the city's lights flickered in the distance, casting a golden hue on the asphalt. The energy of the place felt different now. People walked past her without a second glance, unaware of what had just transpired in the shadows of that empty lot. But she knew. Cassie Dawson wasn't just another college student. She wasn't just a quiet girl sitting in a diner, trying to study her way through finals. No, there was a history behind her calm demeanor, a history that had shaped her into the person she was today. She paused at the crosswalk, watching as cars sped past. Her thoughts drifted back to the days before she'd come to this town, before the quiet campus and the peaceful life she had built for herself. The days when she'd worn a different uniform, carried a different responsibility. The days when she had been a Marine. And before that, the years of rigorous training that had made her a black belt in karate. All those years spent learning how to move without hesitation, how to anticipate every threat, how to use every ounce of strength when the situation called for it. She remembered the discipline, the long hours of practice, the days when she felt like she might break but pushed herself anyway. The lessons from her mentors and fellow Marines, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose that came with the uniform. But it hadn't always been easy. The Marines had been demanding. They required everything: sacrifice, loyalty, unwavering resolve. And when she left, it hadn't been a decision she had made lightly. No, Cassie hadn't left because she was weak or afraid. She left because she needed a change. She needed peace. But that peace had always been fragile, and it wasn't the kind of thing that lasted forever. Sometimes, life came knocking in ways you couldn't avoid. Like Rick and his gang. But Cassie had learned something over the years. You couldn't hide from your past, from your training, from who you were. You could try, but the moment someone pushed you, you'd realize that you still carried it all within you. Every lesson, every skill, every instinct. And tonight, when the bikers had tried to push her, she'd realized something else: she was strong enough to stand her ground, not because of the uniform or the belt, but because of the choices she'd made. Cassie smiled to herself, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling her chest. She was living her life the way she wanted. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. As she crossed the street, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her friend, Carla, one of the few people she trusted completely. "You good? Heard there was some trouble tonight. If you need anything, you know where I am." Cassie typed back quickly. "All good. Thanks for checking in." She smiled to herself again, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Her circle was small, but it was strong. Carla had always had her back, and Cassie appreciated that more than words could express. Her thoughts shifted again. The night was still young, but she was tired. It had been an eventful evening, and she felt the weight of it in her bones. She turned onto a quieter street, making her way back to her apartment. The lights from the nearby shops flickered off as she passed, and the streets were quieter now, almost empty. The world felt like it was settling into the quiet of the night. She felt like she was, too. But just as she reached the entrance to her building, a car pulled up beside her, its engine purring softly in the night air. Cassie instinctively tensed, her hand inching toward her side. But when she saw who it was, she relaxed. It was the older man from the diner, the one who had watched her take down Rick's gang. "Hey," he said, rolling down his window. "You need a ride?" Cassie shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thanks, but I'm good. Just going home." The man studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, before he nodded. "You're a tough one." "I respect that." Cassie nodded in return. "Thanks. I appreciate it." He started to pull away, but then he stopped, rolling the window back down. "If you ever want to talk," he said, his voice quieter this time, "there's more people like you out there. You don't have to be alone in this." Cassie's smile softened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of his words. It wasn't just the fight she had won. It was the connection, the acknowledgement of what she had been through, and the understanding that she wasn't alone in her journey. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice quiet but genuine. The car drove off, and Cassie turned back toward her building, the door now just a few steps away. But as she reached it, she paused. She looked back out into the night, the city lights glittering around her. For a moment, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something big and unknown. But the fear that once would have gripped her now seemed distant. She wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. Cassie Dawson had learned to embrace it. And no matter what came next, she would be ready. The bikers' motorcycles roared to life, and their loud engines quickly faded into the distance, leaving the once tense atmosphere in the diner to fall into a stunned silence. Cassie stood there for a moment, her eyes calmly scanning the room, her mind still sharp and alert, but with a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in her chest. She had known, in the depths of her being, that it wasn't about proving anything to those bikers, it was about standing up for herself and anyone else who might have been too scared to do it. Slowly, the silence in the diner began to dissolve. A few of the patrons whispered to each other, nodding their heads in appreciation, while others exchanged glances with Cassie, as if trying to process what had just happened. Then, the first round of applause started. It was hesitant at first, just a few scattered claps from the corner booths. But soon, others joined in. The small crowd in the diner began to applaud in earnest, and the noise filled the space louder, more confident, and filled with respect. Cassie stood still, her face betraying no emotion. She wasn't someone who sought attention. The applause wasn't what mattered to her. What mattered was that the bikers had been forced to leave without a fight, their arrogance and bullying put in check. What mattered was that, for the first time in a long while, someone had stood up to them, and the outcome had been fair. The waitress, a young woman with a warm smile, rushed toward her, practically bouncing in her step. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her eyes wide with gratitude. "But I'm so glad you did." Cassie simply shrugged, her demeanor calm and unaffected by the praise. They needed a reminder. Respect goes both ways. The words were simple, but they carried weight. And Cassie knew that the message would stick. Not just for the bikers, but for everyone in that diner. She wasn't looking for gratitude, but in that moment, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done the right thing. The waitress smiled, her face lighting up. "That was incredible. You really showed them who's boss." She paused, glancing around at the other customers, who were now slowly returning to their meals, the tension having dissipated. "You've got some serious skills." Cassie gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's just something I picked up over the years." She wasn't one to brag about her past, but she also wasn't going to hide it. After all, it wasn't the past that defined her, it was what she chose to do with it now that mattered. The waitress nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, I think everyone here owes you a drink." "On the house, of course." She turned to the barista, who had been watching the scene unfold, and gave him a subtle wave. "Hey, get her whatever she wants." "It's on me." Cassie hesitated for just a moment. The last thing she wanted was to draw any more attention to herself. But she appreciated the gesture. She had seen enough of people who either feared her or tried to undermine her, but this was different. There was no fear in the waitress's eyes, only admiration. It felt like a small victory, the kind that mattered to Cassie, even if no one else understood its significance. "Coffee's fine," Cassie replied, her voice soft but clear. The waitress nodded and hurried off to place the order. As she did, Cassie took a seat at the nearest booth. Her backpack, which she'd carried through the whole ordeal, felt heavy against her shoulder, but she didn't mind. It was a constant reminder of the life she had chosen, the life she was still building. The noise of the diner slowly returned to normal. The patrons resumed their conversations, the clink of silverware on plates blending with the soft hum of chatter. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Cassie could feel it, even if it wasn't said out loud. The bikers may have left, but the energy in the room was different. Cassie's eyes drifted over to the counter, where the older man from before sat, watching her with an approving look on his face. He wasn't one to express emotions easily, but she could tell that he respected what she had done. And in that moment, she felt like she'd earned it. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been put down, underestimated, or told they didn't matter. The waitress returned with the coffee, setting it down in front of Cassie with a smile. "Here you go. One coffee, just like you asked." Cassie smiled back, the first real smile she'd shown all night. "Thank you," she said, lifting the cup and taking a slow sip. The warmth of the coffee filled her, grounding her back into the present moment. The older man approached her then, his footsteps steady but measured. "You handled yourself well," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Most people wouldn't have the guts to face a group like that." Cassie looked up at him, a slight frown tugging at her lips. "I didn't do it for anyone's approval. I did it because it was the right thing to do." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. But still, not everyone can do what you just did. You've got something special." Cassie wasn't sure what to say to that. She didn't want to dwell on what made her different or special. The past was something she didn't like to revisit too often. But she also couldn't deny that what she had done wasn't something just anyone could pull off. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about knowing when to stand firm, when to let go, and when to make your voice heard. The man smiled again, this time more knowingly. "I've seen people like you before. People who've had to fight their own battles. I just hope you don't forget who you are along the way." Cassie met his gaze, nodding slowly. "I won't." As the man turned and walked back to his seat, Cassie felt a warmth settle deep within her. She hadn't expected any kind of praise or recognition, but somehow, in that moment, it felt right. The diner felt quieter now, the energy having shifted from tension to a calm aftershock. The tables around her had relaxed, and even the staff seemed less hurried, more at ease. Cassie finished her coffee in silence, reflecting on what had just happened. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into that diner. She had stood up for herself, not just in the moment, but in a way that would stick with her. As she stood to leave, the waitress gave her one last smile and a nod of gratitude. "Take care, okay? Don't let anyone walk over you again." Cassie smiled back, a little more brightly this time. "I won't." The cool night air greeted her as she stepped outside, but it didn't feel harsh against her skin. In fact, it felt almost refreshing. She walked down the street slowly, her steps sure and steady, feeling lighter than she had all evening. The world might not have changed in any grand way, but Cassie knew one thing for certain: she had just reclaimed her peace. Cassie sat back down at the booth, her fingers flipping open her notebook as if nothing had happened. The loud clattering of dishes and the soft murmur of voices filled the diner once more, but Cassie was focused. The adrenaline from the earlier encounter had begun to fade, but the calm strength that remained in her was solid, like a rock beneath a calm ocean. The waitress, still with a grateful smile on her face, returned to Cassie's table with a fresh cup of coffee. "Here you go. I hope it's just the way you like it," she said, setting the cup down in front of Cassie with a small wink. Cassie offered a soft smile in return, nodding her thanks. She didn't need the attention, but it was nice to be seen for who she really was. The waitress hadn't asked for anything in return, yet her gesture felt genuine. It wasn't about the coffee, it was about the respect between them, a simple, unspoken understanding that sometimes, small acts of kindness make all the difference. Cassie's fingers traced the edge of her notebook, her mind moving away from the diner and back to the bigger picture. She wasn't looking for accolades or recognition. No, for Cassie, strength wasn't about proving something to others. It wasn't about showing off, or forcing people to acknowledge her. True strength, she believed, was knowing when to stand tall, when to speak up, and when to let the silence do the talking. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room. She didn't need to be. She understood that actions often spoke louder than words. She thought back to the bikers. She had stood up to them not because she needed to impress anyone, but because she knew that no one, no matter how big, loud, or tough, had the right to walk over her. Or anyone else for that matter. What she had done wasn't about teaching them a lesson, though. It was about sending a message not just to them, but to herself. Cassie had been underestimated for much of her life, not just by others, but even by herself at times. But standing in that diner, in front of those men, she had remembered who she truly was. She had remembered her training, her values, and the quiet power that lay within her. That power wasn't about violence or aggression. It wasn't about showing people how tough she was. It was about standing in her truth. The bikers had tried to bully her, to force her into a place where she felt small. But what they didn't know, what no one really knew, was that Cassie had been through things that had shaped her in ways they couldn't imagine. Her time as a Marine had taught her resilience. Her black belt in karate had taught her discipline and respect. But more than that, she had learned the value of quiet strength. In the moment, when the bikers had pushed too far, Cassie hadn't reacted in anger. She hadn't let them draw her into a fight. She had simply acted swiftly and decisively, reminding them that strength didn't always show itself in big, loud ways. It was in the calmness that preceded action, the confidence that came from knowing you didn't have to prove anything to anyone. It was then that Cassie realized something important. Those bikers, in all their brashness and bravado, had likely never experienced someone like her before. They were used to getting what they wanted through fear and intimidation. But Cassie hadn't flinched. She hadn't let them make her afraid. She hadn't been rattled by their loud voices and threats. Instead, she had stood her ground and, in doing so, shown them a lesson they would never forget. The bikers would think twice before underestimating anyone again. And it wasn't just because of what had happened in the diner that night. No, it was because Cassie's strength had come from a deeper place, a place inside that couldn't be shaken by loud words or intimidating actions. They hadn't just learned to fear her, they had learned that sometimes, those who are quiet, those who don't boast or show off, are the ones who hold the most power. Cassie took a slow sip of her coffee, feeling its warmth seep through her and ground her in the present. As she set the cup down, she glanced around the diner. People were going about their business, a little more aware now, perhaps a little more mindful of the people around them. There was no more tension in the air, no more feeling of something about to boil over. It was a small moment in the grand scheme of things, but to Cassie, it was everything. She had reminded herself of who she was, and in doing so, she had given a reminder to the others too. Strength wasn't about how many people you could intimidate or how loud you could shout. It wasn't about forcing people to see you. Strength was about standing tall, even when no one was watching. It was about knowing that, at the end of the day, you didn't need anyone's approval to know your worth. And that, Cassie realized, was what truly mattered. The waitress came back once more, this time to clear the table. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes still full of admiration. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly. "You were amazing. I think everyone in here feels a little bit safer tonight." Cassie nodded, her gaze softening. "You're welcome. Sometimes, it just takes one person to make a difference." The waitress smiled warmly, then turned and left to take care of the other tables. Cassie watched her go, feeling a wave of calm wash over her. She hadn't been looking for thanks, but it was nice to be appreciated. As Cassie stood to leave, the sounds of the diner returned to their normal rhythm: the clink of plates, the buzz of conversation, the hum of the coffee machine in the background. No one was talking about her anymore. No one was watching her every move. The moment had passed, and it was time to move on. But Cassie knew that the events of that night would stay with her. Not because of the bikers or the applause, but because of the lesson she had learned and the lesson she had taught others, without even trying. She stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling the crisp breeze against her skin. The city stretched out before her, the street lights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The world was big, and sometimes, it could be a little overwhelming. But in that moment, as Cassie walked down the street, she knew that no matter what the world threw at her, she was ready. Sometimes, the ones you overlook carry the biggest lessons. It wasn't about proving something to anyone else. It was about knowing your own strength, standing tall in the face of adversity, and holding your ground when it mattered most. And that was the kind of strength that couldn't be taken away. Cassie walked on, her step steady and confident, a small but proud smile on her face.